Chicago, Sunday night, November 22nd, 1987. The city settled into its familiar rhythms. Elevated trains sighing around corners, living rooms washed in television glow, football highlights easing everyone toward another work week. The air felt ordinary, the way a long weekend night often does. And then, for thousands of people watching the local news, the ordinary snapped. At 9:14 p.m., WGN's 9 o'clock news was deep in the sports block when the picture cut to black. For a heartbeat, it was only silence, a gap just long enough to stir unease. The signal returned, not to the anchor's desk, but to a figure that had no business being there. A glossy, grinning mask filled the frame. Sunglasses, fixed smirk, unmistakably styled after Max Headroom, the 1980s icon who mocked television even as he lived inside it. Behind the mask, a panel of corrugated metal drifted in and out of view. The image jittered. The audio scraped like a damaged tape. The figure bobbed in a way that felt mechanical and wrong. There was no introduction and no explanation. There were no controls in anyone's home to change what their set was now showing. It lasted barely half a minute. WGN's engineers reacted fast, forced a path back to their studio feed, and knocked the intruder out. The anchor reappeared, surprised, steady, professional, and the newscast moved forward. Control room phones lit up. Engineers began tracing the invisible path that had been breached. Viewers did what viewers do. They exchanged guesses, made a joke, told themselves it was some odd glitch, the kind that happens once and never again. The night wasn't done. Shortly after 11:20 p.m., PBS station WTTW was airing a rerun of Doctor Who, an episode set among lighthouses and fog, a story literally called Horror of Fang Rock. Mid-episode, the picture buckled again. The same masked figure appeared, but this time the silence was gone. The voice was high-pitched and warped, as if the recording had been dragged across a misaligned head. The intruder spoke in fragments, mockery, inside jokes, bent slogans. A soda tagline that once dripped with 1980s cool surfaced and curdled on contact. A well-known Chicago sportscaster was jabbed by name. The letters behind WGN, world's greatest newspaper, the old Tribune boast, were thrown back as an insult. A gloved hand waved. The camera lurched. The corrugated panel kept drifting in the frame, a cheap stand-in for the computerized grids Max Headroom once inhabited on TV. Then the performance tilted from unsettling to unhinged. The masked figure slipped out of frame. Another person appeared, a fly swatter raised, the moment skidding toward a prurient, juvenile stunt. There was no manifesto, no demand, no clear motive. It was trespass for its own sake, dressed in parody and static. And then it was gone. Doctor Who returned as if a page had been torn from the middle of the script and hastily taped back in. 90 seconds had been stolen. The episode didn't know where to rejoin itself. Phones rang harder. WTTW's engineers redrew their signal paths and replayed the intrusion frame by frame. Reporters filled columns with puns and questions. The Federal Communications Commission opened a case. So did the FBI. Across the city, a simple question rippled through newsrooms and living rooms. How could anyone do this? To understand the answer, you have to picture how broadcast television moved through a city in 1987. Programming originated in a studio. Cameras, switchers, a control room. From there, it traveled to a high-power transmitter mounted on a skyscraper. In Chicago, those transmitters sat like crowns on the John Hancock Center and the Sears Tower. The path from studio to tower was a focused microwave link, an invisible beam aimed at a small dish on the transmitter's roof. The transmitter obediently took whatever arrived on that dish and hurled it across the air to the city. There were two broad ways to corrupt that path. The blunt way was to enter the transmitter site and meddle with the gear. The cleverer way, and the one engineers believe happened, was to stand somewhere with a clean line of sight to the receiving dish on the skyscraper and overpower the legitimate studio feed with your own counterfeited signal. If your directional microwave transmission was stronger at the dish and tuned correctly, the transmitter would accept it as the real thing. In analog, the loudest, best-aimed signal wins. Before we chase the signal up the tower, ask yourself this: if anyone with the right gear could hijack a city for a minute, how many tried and failed without any of us ever noticing? That is the seam the intruders exploited, the narrow place where one signal could shove another aside. It explains the chaos viewers saw, the unstable audio, the cheap set, the bobbing frame that looked like home video forced through a noisy path. Nothing in that method required cracking a digital code or hacking a computer. It required practical knowledge, the right equipment, a precise angle to the dish, and the nerve to press play. Look at the night through that lens and certain details fall into place. The hijackers probably rehearsed. They likely scouted rooftops, terraces, and upper windows downtown, hunting for clean geometry to the transmitter sites. They needed frequency information for each station's studio-to-transmitter link, gear to generate a video feed, a directional antenna to focus it, and a transmitter with enough power to shout down the real signal at the dish. The early WGN Intrusion, short, silent, ugly, reads like a proof of concept. Punch in, hold the frame, escape. The later WTTW Intrusion feels like the main event. Audio live, a chaotic script prepped, someone else working the camera, the corrugated backdrop propped to mimic Max Headroom's synthetic world on a fraction of a budget. Choosing Max Headroom wasn't random. In the mid-'80s, Max was television turned inside out. A synthetic host who glitched on screen, mocked commercials while making them, and interrupted fictional broadcasts inside his own story world. Wearing that mask to seize a real signal turned satire into a dare. The form and the content fused into one provocation. This medium can be hijacked, and you're watching it happen. Investigators moved along two tracks. On the technical side, they tried to triangulate where a pirate beam could have originated. That meant mapping lines of sight, calculating power levels, and comparing angles from likely rooftops to the transmitter dishes. They combed the intrusion tapes for clues. The metal panel behind the figure resembled a standard corrugated sheet you'd find in warehouses and loading bays. The room looked cramped. The camera position shifted during the second broadcast, suggesting another pair of hands. The voice was intentionally pitch-shifted, frustrating any attempt to match its grain. On the human side, they followed tips that pointed to people with the skill and access to try such a thing. Broadcast technicians with grudges, students with keys and curiosity, ham radio enthusiasts who had graduated to microwave links. The FCC promised consequences, steep fines, even jail time. The FBI asked for leads. No arrests followed. The case generated interviews and theories, not charges. Days became weeks. A much larger story, the sudden death of Chicago's mayor, pulled the city's attention away. Leads cooled. The statute of limitations for obvious charges eventually ran out. The hijackers, if they watched the coverage, must have felt the pressure swell and then recede like a wave. The equipment was boxed up, sold off, or repurposed. The secret hardened. What had briefly been a live investigation slid into lore. Theories multiplied in the space that remained. One camp favored the aggrieved insider with access to equipment and a store of petty grievances that echoed in the intruder's script. Another imagined a small ring of hobbyists with real technical chops and a taste for theater. A more romantic version painted a handful of radio tinkerers staging a one-night art piece against a vast, complacent industry. None of those stories can be proved. The tape is too crude to give up fingerprints of identity. The city offered too many rooftops to turn a careful guess into a warrant. People still argue about whether the caper was harmless. No one was physically hurt. No ransom or ideology came attached. The two targets were a local newscast and a beloved science fiction show. Yet that frame misses what the intrusion revealed. Television in the 1980s wasn't just entertainment. It was a trusted public signal. It carried emergency alerts, election results, and community warnings. For many households, it was the most immediate bond to civic life. The Max Headroom hijacks worked because they violated that trust. For 90 seconds, a stranger found the seam in a system built to feel seamless and shoved their signal through it. Watch the WTTW tape today, and it hasn't improved with age. The humor is adolescent and private. The props look like what they are. Scraps chosen for convenience. The camera wanders. The voice grates. If the clip still has power, it's not from what the intruder said. It's from what the intrusion proved, that even a monolithic medium can be forced to blink. The analog world made that possible. The chain from studio to transmitter to living room was a series of obedient links, each passing along whatever arrived from upstream. The tower didn't authenticate the signal. It simply amplified the one that hit the dish. That's why the right metaphor for the stunt is not some elegant cyber breach, but a shove through a narrow seam. Collect enough information, stand in the correct spot with a dish and a transmitter, and you could push your world onto everyone else's screen. Since then, technology and policy have changed the landscape. The transition to digital broadcasting hardened many of the old pathways. Fiber replaced some of the air. Encoders and checks reduced the chance that a stray microwave shove would be believed. None of that seals a complex system against every attack. No large system is unbreakable. But the specific method used in 1987 is far harder to reproduce in the wild today. In that sense, the Max Headroom incident is a period piece. Its analog seams are part of its texture. What endures is the feeling it left behind. Picture a living room that night. A sink running, a notebook open, a child wandering in and out of the doorway. The sports segment hums. Then a mask cuts in and the world inside the television belongs to a stranger. You didn't select it. You can't mute it. You can't explain it quickly enough to make it ordinary again. Television was supposed to be safe by design, the straightest line from studio to screen. That night showed how easily a straight line can be bent. It also matters that the mask was Max Headroom's. He was the decade's most precise joke about television. A synthetic host who glitched, smirked, and embraced artifice while selling the very products he mocked. He interrupted fictional broadcasts as part of his shtick. Wearing that face to conquer a real broadcast completed a loop the character always flirted with, fiction ramming its shoulder into fact. For viewers in 1987, that made the intrusion uncanny in a way that outlived the jokes themselves. It felt like their television had learned to parody them without permission. If you had to choose, was it an insider with keys? Or a van parked where the line of sight to the dish was perfect? Your answer says how safe you think our signals really are. There is a quieter thread in this story, the one that runs through people rather than towers. Whoever did it likely watched the coverage the next day with a private mix of pride and fear. They saw the FCC's stern language and the FBI's appeals. They looked at their gear and felt the walls closing in. Then the city's attention shifted. The days passed. The fear receded. A few boxes were moved to a garage. A story that might have ended with a name and a charge slipped instead into the kind of secret people carry for decades. And that, perhaps, is why the incident still looms so large. The footage remains strange. The room looks like a storage bay with a metal panel propped to fake a digital grid. The camera bobs and loses its subject, as if the operators were improvising in real time. The voice is pitched just far enough from natural to keep you from placing it. You can pause frames and measure angles and still end up with only guesses. The tape became exactly the kind of artifact people argue about late at night. Shared by everyone, owned by no one, answerable to nothing except the fact that it happened. Taken at a distance, the Max Headroom broadcast Hijack is less a whodunit than a how. How did someone identify the seam? How did they gather the right parts, pick the right night, and aim the beam into a city's transmission path? And how did they walk away, leaving behind a clip that every engineer recognizes as possible and every investigator curses as a missed chance? Those questions matter because they expose the fragility of systems that feel invulnerable simply because they are invisible. The moment a system becomes invisible in daily life, we mistake it for invincible. That night proved otherwise. It ends the way many mysteries do, more atmosphere than answers. A Sunday night, a black cut, a plastic face, sports highlights interrupted, a science fiction show snapped in two and crudely spliced back together, engineers scrambling in rooms stacked with monitors, investigators plotting angles that never converged, and in homes all over Chicago, a minute and a half that lodged in memory because it rewrote the rules of who gets to speak. The towers kept broadcasting. The week moved on. But a fact remained, humming quietly in the background of every replay. The signal we trust has seams. Someone found one and pushed through it. That's the part that still matters long after the jokes have wilted and the props look cheap. 90 seconds was all it took to show that control can slip. A Sunday night. A cut to black. A mask that didn't belong there. And for 90 seconds, in a place that wasn't theirs, someone else's signal taking over yours. If you enjoyed this journey, hit subscribe, share your theory below, and join us next time on Vault of Forgotten Mysteries, where the past is never quite finished.